Welcome, ghouls, to today's episode of Mental Health is Horrifying. I'm your horror Barbie host of Darkness, Candace Green, psychotherapist and all-around spooky bitch, podcasting from my bat-filled cave in Toronto, Canada. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the apocalyptic. Today's forecast is misty with a chance of monsters, low-key 2007 creature feature, The Mist. Now, I had seen this movie a handful of times over the years, and upon a rewatch for this episode, I really wanted this movie to just be about climate change. I mean, it's easy to see it that way, pure and simple. Like, there's literally monsters in the mist outside that prevent people from going out lest they get eaten. But on closer inspection, there is so much more going on here and begs the question, is climate change really just environmental terrorism? And who exactly are the real monsters here? So let's get into it. Let's talk about the Mist portrayal of climate anxiety, a psychological concept called sense-making, in and out groups, spiritual bypassing, and hopelessness. Good times.
Now listen, everybody. We are experiencing some kind of disaster.
No, it's the end of days. Oh my God.
Something in the mist! Shut the doors! Shut the doors!
I don't know whether it's man-made or natural, but I do know that it's definitely not supernatural.
Nobody else heard that sound?
What sound? I don't know. Like something was pressing against the door.
But the only way we're going to help ourselves is to seek rescue. We're going out.
Tie this around your waist.
What for?
It'll let us know you got at least 300 feet.
There's nothing out there. Nothing in the mist.
What if you're wrong?
Then I guess the joke would be on me.
Time to take sides. The saved and the damned. Read the good book. It calls for blood.
Think something got in? Guys, I hear something.
Don't you know the truth? We are being punished.
You try it. We have to get out of here.
Who knows how far this mist has spread?
It could be the whole world for all we know. Wouldn't make us any less dead.
Daddy, don't go.
If something happens, cut and run. You can't go out. I won't allow it. Won't allow it?
It was them who brung down the final wrath upon us!
We want the boy.
That's what brung down the wrath of God!
We open on our hero, David Drayton, enjoying a lovely painting session at home during a thunderstorm, as one does. He is painting a Western movie poster, a sly nod to Stephen King's Dark Tower series, flanked by a painting of the movie poster from The Thing, which is about an extraterrestrial life form that comes to destroy them all, and how, in those circumstances, people can turn on each other in times of high stress and uncertainty. Foreshadowing! The thunderstorm strikes the small town of Bridgeton, Maine, causing a tree to fall into the lakeside home of artist David, his wife Stephanie, and their 8-year-old son Billy. While surveying the damage the next morning, they notice a thick mist advancing over the lake. Before they leave for town, they wonder whether it has anything to do with the local military base, where the military is working on something called Project Arrowhead. From inside the local supermarket where everyone becomes trapped, they watch police cars speed down the street. A terrified local, Dan Miller, runs into the store and warns of danger lurking in the mist. As a civil alert siren sounds, store managers Ollie Weeks and Bud Brown close off the supermarket and the mist envelops the store. One woman pleads for help in getting home to her children, as the rest of the townspeople leave her high and dry for her to get home all on her own. Against David's advice, bagger Norm starts to go outside to fix the store's emergency generator, at which point he is promptly murdered by the tentacle arm of a monster. David and Ollie direct the customers to barricade the storefront windows as David tries to warn everyone of the dangers of the mist, and many refuse to believe him. And theories begin to emerge. Some people straight up just start getting drunk, some are in total denial, while others, like Mrs. Carmody, a religious fanatic, begins preaching the mist as a sign of the biblical apocalypse, convinced that they are being punished for being dirty, hedonistic sinners who love Satan. Brent disbelieves the dangers of the mist and leaves the store with a small group to seek outside help. His group is also attacked and eaten by mist monsters. These people gotta stop going outside. David forms connections with several people inside the store, including Amanda Dunphy and Irene Repler, two teachers who came into conflict with Mrs. Carmody over her religious take on the ongoing disaster. Amanda carries a revolver in her purse and gives it to Ollie, who is a former regional shooting champion. As night falls, enormous insects and pterodactyl-like creatures are attracted to the light and begin breaking through the store windows. In the ensuing panic, 2 people are killed while another receives fatal burns while attempting to incinerate the insects. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carmody is miraculously spared, adding further fuel to her holy fire as she proselytizes and gains followers among the survivors who are rapidly losing hope. A small group go to the neighboring pharmacy in search of medical supplies, but, as you might expect, they are attacked by giant spiders that kill 2 men, forcing them to retreat. Meanwhile, the mood inside the store becomes more desperate. Even more people turn to alcohol, while others begin to believe Mrs. Carmody's apocalyptic ramblings about blood sacrifices. The next day, following the suicides of 2 soldiers from the local military base, weirdly timed, a 3rd soldier, Jessup, reveals that a government project to discover other dimensions was underway at the base, and that scientists accidentally opened a doorway into the creature's habitat. Whoopsie! Angered and vengeful, Mrs. Carmody's followers react by beating up and then offering Jessup as a sacrifice to the monster gods and shove him out of the supermarket to die a horrible, painful death at the hands of giant praying mantis-like creatures. At this point, the vibes are completely off in the supermarket, like all the way off. People are really losing it and becoming increasingly desperate, hopeless, and religious. As David and his group prepare to leave the store the next morning, they are stopped by Mrs. Carmody. Billy, a child, has been chosen by her group to be delivered as the next sacrifice to the monster gods. As the crowd descends on Amanda and Billy, Ollie shoots and kills Mrs. Carmody. The traumatized survivors then allow the group to leave. As the group makes its way through the parking lot, Ollie is devoured, shock, by the praying mantis-like creature, while 2 others are killed by spider-like creatures from the pharmacy. Bud runs back to the store and is led inside by the patrons. David, Billy, Dan, Amanda, and Irene somehow reach David's car and are able to leave. Driving through the mist, David finds his home destroyed and his wife Stephanie dead. Devastated, he drives away from town, passing a colossal 6-legged beast and eventually running out of gas. With no means of escaping the mist, the adults decide to end their lives. Aiding their suicide, David, off-screen, shoots his own child, Billy, and the other 3 survivors with the 4 remaining bullets before leaving the car to be taken by the creatures. Man, I told you this was getting grim. Just as he exits the car to accept his fate, the mist suddenly dissipates, revealing the vanguard of a U.S. Army armored column beginning the process of exterminating the creatures and restoring order. David, seeing that the army has also rescued survivors, including the woman who left to go get her children that nobody would help, realizes that he killed his son and fellow survivors as they were just moments away from rescue. He drops to his knees, screaming in despair. Like, damn! Damn, David! The Mist was adapted from a psychological horror novella by King of My Heart, once again, Stephen King. First published by Viking Press in 1980 as part of the Dark Forces anthology, an edited version was subsequently included in King's 1985 collection Skeleton Crew. King was inspired to write The Mist by a trip to his local supermarket following a thunderstorm, during which he imagined prehistoric animals and giant insects besieging the building. What a wonderful imagination he has. The film is directed by Frank Darabont, who had already directed 3 film adaptations of Stephen King novellas, including The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, and The Majestic. When it was announced that he was making a horror film titled The Mist, based on King's novella of the same name, fans and critics all around the world sat up and paid attention. Among much fanfare, The Mist was released in cinemas in 2007, and public reception was one of dismay and confusion. What audiences were expecting was a formulaic monster movie rife with shocks and horrors, and the film had very few of these. Over the years, as film lovers have revisited The Mist against the backdrop of evolving fears and anxieties relating to humanity, xenophobia, and climate anxiety, the film found a new resonance. What audiences began to realize was that the film was not so much about the monster in the mist as it was about the monster within us, that it was not so much about the horrors that these fiends bring upon us as it was about those that we bring upon ourselves, that it was not so much about the shocking nature of these horrible creatures as it was about the shocking nature of humankind. The Mist, it was soon realized, was a monster film where we were the monsters. The Mist was produced by Dimension Films, a production company that holds an especially fond place in my heart for being the entire engine behind the 90s Y2K horror movie cycle that completely changed the game. In the 80s, horror was largely a boys' club, and the 90s was an era that saw an empowered final girl and leverage a concept called intertextuality, meaning that studios were smart enough to recognize the untapped potential of placing teen heartthrobs, like my favorite and bedroom wall staple Josh Hartnett, from our favorite TV shows and pages of teeny bopper mags in horror movies to bring in an entirely new audience. This was an especially smart way to welcome girls into the world of horror, allowing girls to see themselves not as helpless, lingerie-clad victims, but as the final girl who fights like hell and lives to tell the tale. Horror went mainstream in the 90s, and it did so by speaking to the anxieties of youth during one of the country's most prosperous eras. As a psychotherapist and someone who has always been interested in the depths of the human psyche, this was very appealing to me. Horror films started to address mental health and reflect the zeitgeist of youth culture in a very real way. No longer were films made on low budgets and dependent on niche devotees for success. Horror found its way onto magazine covers, fashion ads, and CD soundtracks. Girl power feminism and a growing distaste for consumerism defined an audience that both embraced and rejected the commercial appeal of these films. Dimension Films was the driving force behind Scream in 1996, which completely changed the course of horror movies forever, and other gems like I Know What You Did Last Summer, Scary Movie, Halloween H2O, The Faculty, and the others. I recently read an incredible book that talks about how the 90s changed horror, called The 1990s Teen Horror Cycle, Final Girls and a New Hollywood Formula, written by Alex West, who is the co-host of The Faculty of Horror, which is my favorite horror podcast. Please give them a listen. And it talks about this exact transition. And you know, before I read this book and learned about what this transition meant in the 90s, I actually thought that I wasn't allowed to call myself a real horror fan. A lot of the cult classic horror movies from the 90s, the ones that you are allegedly supposed to love in order to call yourself a true devotee, never really spoke to me due to their extreme depictions of violence, gore, and sexual violence and objectification of women in particular. For example, there's this scene from 1985's Return of the Living Dead where there's a party happening, and there is a woman completely and inexplicably dancing topless and just wearing her underwear. There's no reason for her to be topless in her underwear, and it makes absolutely no sense to the plot. But I think it was like contractually illegal not to have boobs in a horror movie for no reason in the 80s, so there they were. These movies never felt like they were for me, and reading this book sort of made me realize, yeah, maybe they weren't. So why would I like them? But it doesn't mean I'm not a horror fan. This book gave me the permission to choose what I like and what I don't, and still say, yeah, I'm a diehard horror fan and I'm allowed to be here. As much as I love Dimension films, as is often the case with so many iconic movies from the 90s and early thousands, Dimension Films' parent company was run by the Weinsteins, which is a real punch to the gut due to the culture of violence and abusive behavior the Weinsteins perpetuated throughout the industry. It's that thing where if you drill down to so many beloved movies and TV shows and works of art, so many of our faves are corrupted, aren't they? And it's a real shame that we are asked to take responsibility for the actions of people we don't even know and turn off our love for something like a light switch. A classic both and situation, a concept some of you may be familiar with, meaning that we can acknowledge the presence of two seemingly competing truths at the same time. I love Dimension films, and Harvey Weinstein is an abusive bag of dicks. Anyways, he's in jail now. As with any confusing, uncertain, or unbelievable event, humans will naturally try to make sense of what in the living Monsters in the Mist is going on. And the characters in this movie immediately try to do that once they are all shuttered in the grocery store. Can you even imagine the amount of fear and anxiety they were feeling at that time? It must have been off the charts. At the first indication that something is amiss with this mist, a local, Dan Miller, rushes towards the grocery store shouting, "Something in the mist! It took John Lee!" Immediately, people aren't sure if they can believe him. Or perhaps they don't want to. It's too awful. No one had any certain idea of what was happening, and theories immediately started emerging to try to explain why it was suddenly unsafe to go outside. Is this real? No, this can't be real. Let me go outside and see for myself. Oh no, a monster is eating me. This must be because of a pollution cloud, a chemical explosion. The government has to be involved in this. Was there an earthquake? It's the end of days. From a psychological perspective, what the people trapped in the grocery store are doing is engaging in a process called sense-making. Carl E. Week, the pioneer of sense-making theory, defines sense-making as a continuous mental activity that tries to interpret everything we have already experienced in ways we can accept or believe. It is a process in which people work to understand issues or events that are novel, ambiguous, confusing, or in some way violate expectations. Sense-making gives rise to meaning and structure by reducing chaos to relevant, digestible details. Neuroscientist David Eagleman, in his book Incognito, The Secret Lives of the Brain, said, instead of reality being passively recorded by the brain, it is actively constructed by it. This construction is our sense-making ability. Making sense is largely what the process of psychotherapy work is about, particularly when it comes to someone who has experienced trauma, experiences, or emotions that are unfamiliar, unclear, or unsettling. Processing the feeling, thereby creating a reality and context around it that is actively constructed, can help to make things feel less chaotic, foreign, or out of control. This way, the person can integrate the event or feeling into their experience in a way that makes sense. What's important to note here is that sense-making is an intersubjective process, meaning that reality is constructed and then shared by individuals through their own individual personal experiences, ones that may differ greatly from the person next to them. Which is why the good people of the Mist come to such wide-ranging theories to explain what was happening to them. For the devout churchgoer, it makes sense that Mrs. Carmody would believe the monsters to be harbingers of the biblical end of days. For someone critical of the structures and the world around them, it makes sense that they would believe this to all be part of some government conspiracy. And for others, it makes sense to just be like, I have no idea what any of this means, but I'm getting drunk. Trying to make sense of surreal weather patterns occurring right outside your door certainly speaks to a level of climate anxiety many are experiencing right now. Just a couple of weeks ago, many cities across North America experienced hazy, smoky, yellow-tinged skies that brought about the worst air quality in decades from raging wildfires. Similarly to the Mist, people were asked to stay indoors as school outings and sporting events were canceled and zoo animals, poor animals, were taken into shelter and joggers everywhere were forced to suffer inside on treadmills. Environment Canada urged anyone outside to wear a mask. Experts have pointed to a warmer and drier spring than normal as the reason behind the trend, a sure sign of climate change. Or at least that's the sense I've made of it. Maybe my neighbor thinks it was aliens descending from the sky. Or maybe my optometrist thinks it was the government unleashing mind-controlling substances on us. Who knows? No one talks to their neighbors in Toronto, especially not unless they exist in the same echo chamber as they do. Which brings me to our next topic of discussion about in-groups and out-groups. The Mist was released in 2007, so we have to consider it within the context of a post-9/11 world in the United States. The 9/11 era brought fear to the front door of so many, creating a climate where people felt they couldn't even feel safe in their own homes. And The Mist really starts the film off with this message, as we see David having a grand old time painting in his home during a thunderstorm, when a tree branch suddenly breaks through his window like, "Look out, David! Danger is everywhere, even in your quaint town!" The threat of domestic terrorism was ever present at this time, with people suddenly making assumptions about who is and isn't safe, and who are the monsters to be feared out there. The film, irrespective of era, is a commentary on how we act when we presume civilization has crumbled, and in 2007, the belief was that we were poised for a fall. The United States had entered the 4th year of the war in Iraq and was just a few weeks shy of the start of the worst economic recession in modern history. In the early 2000s, Islamophobia was rampant, actually I think it still is, echoing fears of the other we have always experienced. There was communism, now there's Asian hate, black boys in hoodies, the person with or without a mask, depending on where you sit. No matter what, there's always the other. Several groups begin to form in the Mist through the chaos, and people are kind of just turning on each other. There's the Hicks versus the out-of-towners, the saved versus the damned, and the drinkers are just somewhere.
Where do you think you're going, Mr. David Drayton? Are you so anxious to make your boy an orphan?
My boy is no concern of yours.
Listen up. We're going to the pharmacy. We're going to bring back some supplies. Also, there may be people trapped over there who need help.
Listen, folks, listen. We're not going to take any chances. If there's any trouble, we'll come straight back here to the supermarket.
And bring the fiends of hell down on our heads, thank you. She's right. You'll make them notice us. You'll make them come. Why can't you just leave well enough alone?
Lady, this what you call well enough?
You want to stop us? You better explain to Bobby here why we're not bringing painkillers and medicine back for his brother.
No, I'm going.
even if I have to go alone.
You'll die out there, young man. You'll walk out that door and be torn to shreds. And then your hellbound pride will have them come get the rest of us. Yes, they'll come back for all of us, just like this good lady said. Do you want that to happen, people? No! Well, it is this kind of hubris that brought the wrath of God in the first place. This kind of pride and defiance of the...
Shut up, you miserable buzzard!
You old bitch!
That thwacking sound you heard in that clip is Irene throwing a can of peas at Mrs. Carmody's head. The groups that begin to form through allegiances to theories emerging about the mist are a natural outcome of the theory of social identity and in-groups versus out-groups. An in-group is a social group that a person identifies as being a part of based on factors like nationality, race, religion, socioeconomic status, or political affiliation. An out-group is a social group that a person does not identify with based on similar factors that would cause a person to identify with an in-group. People's tendency to consider in-groups and out-groups is such an innate and powerful impulse that they can be made to identify with a new in-group based on entirely random, arbitrary, and seemingly meaningless criteria. For example, I love spinning. I love my spin studio. I love my instructors and everyone I see weekly at that gym. We are the best group of people in the entire world, and you can't tell me that the group of people at the CrossFit gym down the street are better than us. We have more fun, and we're way cooler, and this is probably a scientific fact. I love my spin in group. Essentially, the simple act of being told that we're part of a group can make people identify with the group so profoundly, even if the group members have nothing else in common. We tend to judge and treat people who are like us more favorably than those who are different from us, meaning that we seek out in-groups to positively reinforce our sense of identity, safety, and belonging. And while this sounds horrible and judgmental, it may surprise many of us that the implicit bias and stereotypes that we have grow out of normal functions of the human brain. They are critical to how we perceive, organize, remember, and learn about the world around us. From birth, we start developing neural networks for everything from recognizing speech patterns and forming our first words to learning to crawl, walk, read, or ride a bike. Our brains are associative by design. We learn by making connections between things, clumping, grouping, and pairing concepts. These pairings and associations are learned from childhood, absorbed and shaped by the norms of our family, friends, social and physical environments. They are filters that help us to pay attention to relevant stimuli while ignoring less important things. One scientific estimation estimates that we might be exposed to close to 11 million pieces of information per second. If we were required to process and filter all that sensory information using the conscious mind, we would be utterly overwhelmed and probably incapacitated. Our brains are great multitaskers, though, and can perceive, categorize, and sort up to 40 pieces of information at any one time, which is why humans have evolved mental shortcuts called heuristics to deal with the vast ocean of information we are exposed to. Heuristics are believed to be the mechanism behind intuition, sometimes described as our sixth sense. But it is also important to note that the inherent problem with stereotypes and implicit biases is that they are also forms of heuristics, which is when they can hurt rather than help us. So, since heuristics and implicit biases are often operating on a subconscious level as a function of being a mental shortcut, it is important to stop and raise important pieces of information into our conscious awareness and ask, hey, do I actually believe that? Why do I believe that? Is this really true? Do I have some biases that I need to examine here? But as we see in The Mist, fear is an incredibly powerful motivator to blast right through that slow, mindful process of consciously examining one's biases and move directly to clinging on to the nearest in-group out of fear of the unknown. And one of those groups is the ones I like to call the spiritual bypassers, as led by Mrs. Carmody, masterfully played by Marcia Gay Harden. In his classic book, psychotherapist John Welwood defines spiritual bypassing as the use of spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep personal or emotional issues, to shore up a shaky sense of self, or to belittle basic needs, feelings, and developmental tasks. The goal of such practices, he claimed, was enlightenment. When spiritual practice is used to compensate for challenging traits such as low self-esteem, social isolation, or other emotional issues, Welwood said, they corrupt the actual use of spiritual practice. In other words, using these practices to cover up problems seems like an easy way out as opposed to working on the actual issues at hand. I thought about Mrs. Carmody's use of spiritual bypassing recently as I watched a docu-series about Hillsong and learned about its founder, Brian Houston. Like Mrs. Carmody, Brian Houston, disgraced founding pastor of Hillsong Church that, shockingly, turned out to be an abuse-riddled nightmare, spoke about the second coming of Christ that was supposedly foretold by catastrophic events like fires, floods, famine, plague, and that these prophecies meant that when bad things happen, the closer we are to deliverance. Yikes. Spiritual bypassing is also a defense mechanism for those unwilling or psychologically unable to cope with uncomfortable realities, experiences, or emotions. Developmentally, this strategy can serve us well for extended periods of time when facing difficult emotions is inaccessible or unsafe. However, ultimately, repressed emotions, experiences, and traumas will come to the surface, so it is important to acknowledge, accept, and process them in a safe environment with safe people. And it's like, look, Mrs. Carmody, you can either bypass the fact that there are real live monsters outside trying to eat everyone and ignore how you can actually contribute to safeguarding yourself and everyone around you. Or you could just be like, la 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 la, the power of Christ compels you. In the case of the mist, is the chaos God? Or is it environmental terrorism? Is it an unseen force punishing us for our worldly existence? Or are we the real monsters who have destroyed the earth through consumption and the modern day colonialism of fast fashion and fast food and fast cars and animal exploitation and the need for more and more and more until there really isn't any more? There's this really great sort of body horror moment in the back generator room, the one where bad things keep happening, where a number of the townspeople who had either vanished or were presumed eaten are found to be trapped in these sort of web-like matrices, almost mummified in them, and suddenly they start sprouting these gross monster insect-like things from their own bodies, which is really reflecting the theme about who are the real monsters here. Are the monstrous creatures now pouring out of their own bodies reflections of their own culpability, their own fears, anxieties, and guilt about the monstrous world that they have contributed to? Super gross, but also super metaphorical. Okay, so these people are super duper anxious, which is actually a normal adaptive response to uncertain environmental circumstances such as monsters outside. There is nothing wrong with feeling anxious. This is the body's protective response to a perceived threat. And also, there's a certain point in the movie that I mentioned in the film summary where things really start feeling like they're going off the rails, and anxiety has completely taken over any sort of sense of rational thought. I actually find the first half of this movie to be a bit ho-hum in terms of action and intrigue. And then there's this turning point somewhere around the time the religious fanatics suggest using young Billy as a blood sacrifice to the monster gods. And then they decide to focus all their mounting fears and anxieties on one dude and brutally stab poor soldier Jessup and toss him out to be eaten by monsters. And then the grocer straight up shoots Mrs. Carmody. Yeah, that's the moment when things really feel like they take a turn to hopeless town. I think an important reflection of the hopeless feeling among the townspeople is seen in the presence of military throughout the movie. Towards the beginning, there's speculation that perhaps this weird weather is about some shady military project called Project Arrowhead. And then we see some soldiers in the store, and when young Billy asks if they know what's going on or if they can help in any way, they seem sort of despondent and are like, we have no idea what's going on, and also we can't help you because our cell phones don't work. And Billy's like, don't you have radios? And the soldiers are like, no. And prior to the mist even arriving, we overheard that all military were being held back from leave, suggesting an all-hands-on-deck situation, again that the regular townsfolk are not being let in on. And then things get even worse, if you can believe it, with the soldiers, when we learn that a couple of them have committed suicide in the back room where bad stuff keeps happening. What? And why? As though this whole time they have really known something awful that they haven't been sharing.
I want to talk to the soldiers.
Soldiers? What's that gonna do?
You heard what that MP said at the pharmacy.
David, I'm not even sure I knew he was talking. The situation was insane.
He said he was sorry. Wasn't that the word he used? Sorry?
That's right. He said it was their fault, right?
What did he mean by that?
Well, that's what we're going to find out. Irene, stay with Lily, please.
17 poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne saying, "It is done. It is done." And there were voices and lightning and thunders and a great earthquake, such as was not seen. Yes, come to me. Oh, Steve, we feel the earthquake.
Where's your friends? I ain't seen them. Not that big a store. It's kind of hard to lose.
I ain't seen them. I said, look like the keeper. What do you want from me?
What do you know about this mist?
I don't know nothing. I got nothing to do with it.
That's not what the MP said in the pharmacy before the spiders came out of his skin.
They're not in the store. The only place we haven't looked is the loading dock.
So it's a bit tricky to hear the soldier's voice there, but he's basically sitting on the floor of the supermarket, super despondent. He's off on his own. He's smoking a cigarette, and he really looks like he's completely given up hope. And it kind of makes us think like, why is he giving up hope? Like, they kind of seem like they know something that the rest of us don't. For me, the presence of military throughout this movie is representative of distrust of government and the often hopeless and helpless feelings we have in relation to institutional power. Yes, we have the power to vote and are blessed to live in a democracy, but we can still feel so powerless against the Leviathan, as Hobbes put it. In the Hebrew Bible, a mythical whale-like sea monster that devours ships whole, but as a government form is a powerful state created to impose order upon the weak masses. And when we're talking about mental health, I think it's always really important to consider what structural factors are making it difficult for people to feel well in our society. We don't live in a vacuum and everything is relational, so it's not reasonable to just tell someone to journal and have a positive mindset and shit when there are some pretty significant factors contributing to an unwell world. Things like capitalism and racism and homophobia and government corruption and inflation and the threat of the return of low-rise jeans. And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse in this movie, I feel like I keep saying that, we see David and his small group venture out into the mist in their car to look for help, observing the destruction of the world around them. There are bodies strewn everywhere. There's carnage. Those gross web-like things are all over the place. Cars are overturned. All signs that things are not good. They notice they are running out of fuel and they're stuck and they can hear monsters outside and they feel as though they have lost all hope. David and the other adults decide their only choice is to end their lives, and just after David shoots the others, including his own son, the mist clears. And the military shows up with truckloads of other survivors and supplies, and they begin clearing the wreckage. And again, it's like, damn, David. I want to be very clear that while we're talking about a horror movie, that feelings of hopelessness and suicidal ideation do occur in our lives, and that you, listener, never have to hold those feelings alone or feel like the world would be a better place without you. I encourage you from the bottom of my heart to reach out to someone in your life, a friend, family member, colleague, or mental health worker, and tell them how you are feeling, and please know that you are not alone. I have listed a number of mental health resources in the show notes in case you are looking for one. Reaching out when you are hurting and finding hope when it feels like there is none. I'd like to refer to it within the context of The Mist as picking up the axe. There's this scene early in the movie when we first experience the mist monsters sort of penetrating the barrier of the supermarket for the first time. Norm has gone to the back of the store with the intention of going outside to fix the generator, the place where bad things keep happening, when suddenly a big evil monster tentacle reaches under the garage-style door and begins attacking him. I believe it's David who first grabs the fire axe from the emergency box thing off the wall where you have to smash the glass in an attempt to fight off the monster tentacle, but it's quickly swatted away and sits on the floor for the remainder of the fight. So this tentacle keeps ravaging poor Norm, and it's really doing a number on him. And the few other men in the room are just freaking the hell out and trying to stay out of its way and maybe help Norm, who knows. And I noticed that my eyes just kept going to the axe sitting on the floor. I was like, pick up the axe. Pick up the axe. It's right there. You can just pick it up and chop the tentacle in half. Save Norm. Pick up the axe. And I think that axe is a really great metaphor for combating hopelessness. Now, I'm not one for, you feel depressed? Just do some yoga or think positive thoughts. But I do, however, have to hold the hope sometimes for my clients in therapy when they can't find it themselves. And holding on to that hope sometimes means considering all the places in their lives where they might find it again. In the face of hopelessness, the only remedy is taking care of each other and checking in on some of the really baseline building blocks for mental health. There is something called contact nutrition, which is essential to humans feeling well and in community with each other. We need to look each other in the eye. We need to hear kind words from each other. We need gentle physical touch. We need to share meals together. We need to share rhythm, whether that be dancing, singing, or any type of movement. Beyond that, how is your sleep? Your diet? Exercise? What are the things you can be doing now to make sure you are well cared for? Is there an axe you need to pick up? Pick up the axe. Because, my ghouls, as we learn in The Mist, it is only in the complete absence of hope that true horror exists. And that, my ghouls, is the story of The Mist. Thank you for journeying into the depths with me today, and I hope to find you in the darkness again soon. Be sure to check the show notes for the resources I used to put together today's episode. If you live in Ontario and are interested in psychotherapy with me, I offer tarot talk therapy or just talk therapy sessions, and I also offer biz consulting services for therapists looking to conjure the private practice of their dreams. You can follow me on Instagram at Many Moons Therapy, and you can also learn more about me and my services through my website, manymoonstherapy.com. Or you can howl at the moon and I will hear your call. Bright blessings.